I'm David Pembroke, he's Eddie Jones, and we're back.
One sport, millions of voices. This is Rugby Unity.
It's been 2 years since we were last on air, and a lot's happened since then. How do you look back on that time?
Bit of up and down, mate. Probably more down than up. But, you make decisions on giving things a go, and sometimes it doesn't work out, and it didn't work out with Australia. Now back in Japan and trying to rebuild the rugby there.
So perhaps, given that we left the audience when we did, which was April 2 years ago, it might be worthwhile going back. But for me, really, the story goes back a little bit further than then, to the time when you were relieved of your duties at England. And I remember about a week after that, we started conversations about what's next. And at that point in time, there was already, quite a bit of interest in you coaching. I think there were a couple of French clubs who'd expressed interest. The Japanese Rugby Union had expressed interest, and certainly Australia had expressed interest, because was it already all but done that you were going to be coaching the Australian team after the 2023 World Cup? Had you reached agreement with Australia, or were you still talking?
No, not at all, mate. Look, I had a few discussions with them during the year, but I was only really interested in it if we could change the whole Australian rugby structure. And what I meant by that was that since 2004, 2005, Australia's been consistently unsuccessful, and hasn't been anywhere near where the top 2 or 3 in the world. So in my opinion, the only way you could change that is to go with a more centralised model. Smaller number of Super Rugby teams, have control over your top 50 players in a similar way that Ireland has, but not in the Irish way, in the Australian way. And to do that, that would mean a restructuring of the Super Rugby teams and how the top players are looked after. So to do that, like anything, to build a new office or to build a new studio, you need money. And Australian Rugby didn't have the money, but they were hopeful of going into a private equity deal. So I was only ever interested if they could do that. So we were having discussions about that, and it was only when they said yes, we're prepared to do it, because the other part is that it will take huge political changes, which, as we know in rugby, at any level, that's difficult. Because people who are in the chair don't want to leave the chair, and to stay in the chair, they generally want it to be like it's been.
But so before we get into that and those further discussions, but I remember quite clearly having conversations with you around, is this the right time? Isn't it time just maybe to have a rest? I remember quite clearly saying along the lines of, take a break, you'll still be involved with Suntory. If you really want to go to the World Cup, maybe be a technical director for one of the lesser lights, and then obviously maybe do some media as well. And I think that was the plan that we'd agreed, but Australian Rugby, through the chairman, Hamish McLennan, with the support of the board, came at you pretty hard and turned you around, didn't they?
Yeah, and then it changed from being post 2023 World Cup to being straight away. And my gut feeling was, well, this is going to be hard, right?
You resisted for a while, I remember.
Yeah, but
he got you in the end.
But, when someone comes to you and they want you to coach your country, then you want to do it. Yeah. But, again, I only wanted to do it if I felt there could be real change that could help propel Australia back into the top tier of international rugby, and that involved change in the structure.
But certainly from that time on, so when you did agree, you took the job on, and I do remember very clearly in these conversations what was motivating you was you felt that you could make a difference, because at that time the Australian team was 13 from 37. They hadn't performed particularly well. But my biggest concern was you didn't know what you were getting into. I didn't know what we were getting into, and I was concerned that like we just didn't know because we just spent the last however many years, 6, 7 years working with England. So we had no visibility about what was there.
Yeah, well, I think, that 13 to 37 goes back before that. You know, if you look, Australia hasn't beaten New Zealand, hasn't won the Bledisloe Cup since 2002. So we're now talking about a pattern here. And to break a pattern, you have to disrupt. So coming back, I knew I had to disrupt. And it wasn't going to happen in 12 months. It was going to happen over the period of time leading up to the 2027 World Cup. So that was the master plan. And how could I say no to that? So, I took it on.
It started well.
Well,
from a PR point of view, like the story, the returning hero, the World Cup champion, the visit to Matraville High, the narrative. I remember that first game, the Waratahs Brumbies, when your picture came up on the screen and the 25,000 that were there cheered that you had returned. So there was real positivity around your return at that point in time.
Well, I think that the message was right. We wanted to restructure Australian rugby. We wanted to get back playing like the Wallabies. So the intent and the purpose was right. But then we had to make it happen.
Yeah.
And as it turned out, 2023 in terms of performance was under where we expected to be. We expected to make the quarterfinals of the World Cup. We didn't make that. In the Rugby Championship Rugby Championship, we lost a game to Argentina we should have won. Had New Zealand on the ropes, but just couldn't put them away. So you put all that together and it was a disappointing year.
But prior to the team even taking the field in that year, there were a number of challenges, a number of problems. And I know because it led to me leaving, your frustrations in the way that the Australian rugby was set up at the time and perhaps the resistance to change or your inability to change, it wasn't going in the right direction pretty quickly, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, we had basically underperforming Super Rugby teams. We didn't have great high performance environments in any of the teams, and our players weren't being prepared at the level they needed to be prepared at. And we had, if you take one player, for example, say Taniela Tupou, who's at his best is probably the most dynamic and destructive tight end in the world, but he was coming back from I think it was Achilles problem. Grossly overweight, not in great condition. So that was almost symptomatic of the state of Australian rugby at that stage.
Mm. So as you were going through that preparation period, before you got your hands on the players and started to develop them, what were you thinking around game style? What were you thinking around selections? Because a lot of the criticism ultimately that has been made was that really there didn't appear to be any coherence in the way that you were assembling either the off-field staff, where there was criticism around bringing in experienced coaches and getting rid of rugby coaches, nor the way that the team were sort of playing on the field.
Well, I think, if you look at the first thing, is trying to put an international coaching team together in January. Everyone who's worth their weight is already in a job. Yeah. So you've got to try to pick up people from various areas to put together a team. So that was difficult, getting the right team together. No doubt about that. And then secondly, we had teams at Super Rugby underperforming, right? Underperforming. We were struggling to beat New Zealand teams. So we had a problem trying to put together a team, and there was a big gap between a couple of senior players and the rest of the playing group. And I made a decision we needed to change. We needed to change abruptly. It was probably too much. In the end, it was probably too much. And I tried to develop a more what I believe is the Australian style of rugby, which is a more organised but instinctive style of rugby rather than playing a completely organised style of rugby. And it was too much for the players.
Mm. So in that period, and we'll get to the World Cup and the World Cup selections in a moment, but what did you get right and what did you get wrong in that period in terms of that developing that team leading into the selection of the World Cup squad?
Well, I don't think I got much right. No, in the end, I'd be lying if I could think what I got right. But
why weren't you making good decisions?
Well, I don't think I was making bad decisions, but I don't think I got a lot right. If I had my time again, I don't know what I'd do differently.
Yeah.
You know, we put together a team against the All Blacks. We played in Dunedin. We were ahead 17-3 at half time. Right, we could have scored one other try. We were held up, should have scored that try. 24-3 against the All Blacks. So we were able to do it, but we played we were able to play a very disciplined style of game against an All Black team that attacked their weaknesses. But we weren't able to do that for long periods of time, you know, because it's easy to play good rugby for a short period of time. You look at any game of rugby, for the first 20 minutes, there's nothing between the two teams. Mm-hmm. The difference between good teams is their ability to keep doing it, and you build that discipline and that cohesion up over time. You can't build it up quickly. And we were racing the clock to do that. And at the end, like as I said, what I tried to do was to change too many things. It was too disruptive. I needed to disrupt, but I was trying to disrupt for further down the track in 2027. I didn't think it'd have as significant effect on the playing performance as it did.
Mm. So you're through that period. You're starting to show signs of wear and tear. Your engagement and relationship with the media was, not great at that point in time because the pressure seemed to be getting to you. So how were you feeling as you were sort of heading towards making these big decisions around selection?
Well, I don't think there was any big decisions in terms of selection, mate. Like if you look at the factual part of it, right? If we want to look at the facts, Michael Hooper got injured in the first game against South Africa, hadn't played, wasn't fit, didn't play any rugby, went to the sevens after that, was for most of the time unfit. He wasn't ready to play. So let's put that to bed. So that's one thing, okay. Right? And then what other big selections?
Quade Cooper?
Well, Quade was, I made the decision his influence on the team wasn't going to improve the team. Mm-hmm. He's still a handy player. He's playing second division in Japan. His team's got relegated. I don't want to say any more.
Tom Wright?
Tom Wright, good player. Maybe I got him wrong.
Len Ikitau?
He was injured.
Wasn't available.
Well, he was injured. Yeah. He had a shoulder problem.
But couldn't have brought him.
Well, he could have, but he came. It would have come in late, underprepared. We already had Tupou coming in underprepared. We had Angus Bell. We had a number of players who hadn't played a lot of rugby. So you got to make a decision on how many of those you can keep.
Mm. So you stand by the selection. You think, yep, as far as the players were there, we're right, we're good to go. Take me to Sydney Airport on the day you left. My phone blew up and something had obviously happened, and I then went and had a look at what happened. But that wasn't you. As an experienced international coach, when the journalists were asking what I thought were quite reasonable questions and questions you should have been prepared for, you really didn't perform at a level that would be expected of someone of your experience.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, there's a bit of a backstory to that.
Okay. I've got plenty of time. Tell me.
Right. Well, one part of it was I wasn't prepared.
Right.
And it wasn't great in that area at that time in that terms of media preparation, working with the media. Like there's been criticism of having too much staff, but we were under-resourced in key areas. And one of them was media advice. Second part was I just flew back. I'd flown halfway around the world to bring my wife and dog back to Japan, and they were going to come to Australia. And the dog died, and the dog had, it might seem insignificant, and you got to overcome it.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not saying this is an excuse, but I had my wife on the phone crying about the dog because the dog had replaced our daughter when she left. And I just had such a small level of tolerance at that time. Mm. And it quite irked me. So I lost my cool. Mm. And you do sometimes.
You do?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so then we get into the tournament, and there's a couple of things inside the tournament that I'm keen to sort of understand a little bit more about. The revelation or the story that was printed by a credible journalist in a credible news organisation which alleged that you had been in conversations with the Japanese Rugby Union about taking the job. Clearly, the private equity thing was rolling along in the background, not looking like it was making too much progress. But were you having conversations? Were you preparing for life after the Wallabies at that time?
Well, as I said a number of times, I was asked to give them an opinion on who they needed as Japan head coach. I gave them that. And the only discussions we had about becoming the Japan head coach was post the World Cup when I resigned from.
But it became
Australia.
the story. It became the story of the World Cup in many ways, and post the World Cup, was it? You really couldn't put it to bed, and that's often the case when there's smoke, there's fire. And why weren't you able to successfully communicate that story such that you could put it to bed?
I could only say what happened, mate. And I said that on a number of occasions. I was pretty clear about it. And at the end of the day, like, Australia reneged on the contract. And so
We'll come to that. We'll come to that just in a moment. But what about the World Cup and what about the performance? Obviously, it wasn't what you wanted. When you reflect back on that period, obviously there were high hopes and great expectations. Certainly they'd been somewhat dampened by the performance leading into the World Cup. So I don't know if anyone was expecting Australia were going to challenge for the title, but certainly getting out of the pool was at least table stakes. What went wrong?
Well, yeah, again, I take full responsibility for it. First game we were brilliant against Georgia. I thought we played really well against Georgia, and we had a sort of game that suited the players we had. We were able to play around the strengths of Tupou and Skelton running half back in Tate, McDermott, and the rest of us was okay. And there's no doubt we couldn't cope with the loss of Tupou and Skelton. So went in the Fiji game, and as badly as we played, there was one key episode in the game that cost us the game. And then Wales, I think, just emotionally, we just didn't get ourselves right. Again, we competed pretty hard, but then fell away after half-time.
Were you happy with the effort of the coaching staff? Were you happy with the effort of the players? Did you perform to the best of your ability, do you think?
Well, I don't think we performed the best of our ability, because I think we were good enough to make the quarterfinals. The effort of the players was first class. Can't criticise any of the players. Staff was good. We had to find staff in a short period of time, so I went in with that. And again, the responsibility of the performance comes down to me.
So post the World Cup, the private equity was still unresolved. At what point did you start thinking it might be time to move on?
Well, all during the World Cup, because for this to happen, for us to make the changes we wanted to make in Australian rugby, it had to happen before the World Cup. Like, in reality, to get things going for this year, it needs to be done. It needs to be done in the pre-season. You can't be doing it in season. It needs to be done well before pre-season. And so all during this period, we're trying, with great support from the team manager and Chris Webb, we're trying to put together a program where we can make the changes. So we're working on that during the World Cup. We're asking questions. We're getting different answers. We're hearing one thing from the Rugby Australia, one thing from the provinces. We're being told, no, we've got them in place, we've got them in line. And then from the provinces, I remember having a chat to you about the Brumbies situation, that there was a lot of information that didn't match up. So we went back to the Rugby Australia during the World Cup with a modified option that would cost less money than the full-blown to get us off the ground, right? No answer. Didn't come back. We're working on it. And, in all of this, Hamish McClellan was first class. Like, he wanted to see change, and he wanted to see the changes to Australian rugby that could propel Australia back into the top two. But the private equity was obviously becoming problematic. And by the end of the World Cup, it was clear that it wasn't going to happen. So we went back to them in Paris, made a meeting post the World Cup. We can change it and make it a little bit less the ideal model and a partial model that we can build into over the 4 years, which again is still going to compromise what Australia's going to be like at the 2027 World Cup. If you look at Ireland in terms of World Rugby, Ireland's got a population of 6 million, right? Mm-hmm. 80% of the Irish team comes from Leinster. Leinster comes from 16 private schools where they invest in. And what we needed to do in Australia was find the talent, find the right talent, invest in the talent and bring them through instead of having the talent spread out all over the place. So we went back and the answer was no, it's not going to happen. So, as we discussed briefly, the contract that I had in place, because the only reason I took the job was to make the big change, not the small change.
So it was actually in your contract.
In the contract.
If you do not get the private equity to fund the change, deal's off.
Either party can.
But then at Coogee Oval, sort of, I think it might have been 2 weeks later, you were still saying you were committed to coaching Australia.
Well, I was, as long as they came through with the deal.
Right. So at what point then did you then, but then 2 weeks later, I think it might have been 2 weeks later or maybe a bit more, you took the Japan job. Well, you were offered the
I quit
job.
Australia.
Yeah.
Quit Australia first. Let's get it right here.
Okay, no.
Yeah, quit Australia first and then went to Japan.
But quit Australia, sorry, I got ahead of myself there. So let's go back to that period. So at what point did you decide that, post the World Cup, that it was all over?
Well, we were going there trying to get some indication whether there was any likely of change.
Yep.
And when it became a no-brainer, and I think by then, they're probably thinking, well, do we really want to keep this bloke? Mm-hmm.
They weren't buying what you were selling.
There's the other side of there's the other side of the equation, right? And you only want to stay at a place where you really want it.
Yeah.
Like if they don't want you, you don't want to be there.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to get that impression they don't want me. Right? So I'm thinking I can't do what I want to do. They don't really want me. So I was committed to coach Australia. But then as this evolves, then you're thinking, well, this is not a good fit.
Yeah. But it was a quick period between I'm going to coach Australia, I've accepted the job in Japan, which
no, it wasn't.
Well, how long a period of time?
Well, you tell me.
Japan were interested in you doing the job way back, when you were relieved of your duties in England, like Japan was showing some interest, all the way through to now. So then obviously at that point, is that when you sort of started talking to them about, okay, well, I'm available now?
Post resigning from, we had to talk about the contract with Australia. And once that was finalised, then I decided that I'd have a look at the other job.
How do you feel about that sort of general, well, it's not I wouldn't say it's a general vibe, but there is large sections of the Australian rugby community who are disappointed around that because of the story that they believe to be the right story. And I will accept my share of the responsibility here because I think we got the story a bit wrong early. We sort of set the wrong expectation. And I think ultimately this disappointment has come from the fact that the expectations were high and really were we ever going to match those expectations. But anyway, that's me reflecting on my role. Commenting on that point about that general vibe that, you didn't do the right thing by Australian rugby.
Yeah, well, mate, people can think what they think. But, you don't want to disappoint people. But I'm not thinking, I've got to give myself a shellacking because of that. Like you make decisions on what you think is the right thing. And the decision I made to come to Australia and try to do the Australian job was 100% commitment.
Absolutely,
right?
and I
100% commitment.
I don't think that's in question, but I think.
But I wanted 100% commitment from Rugby Australia as well.
Sure,
right?
Yeah,
and in the end, they couldn't give that.
But I think
so. All the other bits and pieces.
Yeah, but it's the double dealing piece where people think that you were double dealing.
But it's not double dealing, mate.
No, but the perception was that you were making arrangements to leave Australia at the time when you were coaching Australia. But you've explained that wasn't the case. Well, so I accept that.
That was never the case.
Yeah.
That was never the case.
Okay.
That was never the case. And I'm disappointed if people think that. And I apologise to people if they think that. But that wasn't the case.
All right. Well, from that point on, you've then moved to Japan. That's another story to tell over time. And I don't think we need to really go back there and talk about it again. Anything you want to say in summary of that period?
Well, I think, part of the things we were saying has already turned out to be right, that, with 4 Super Rugby teams, it's sad about the demise of the Rebels because the people down there were doing a really good, strong job in trying to develop rugby in Victoria. And it's sad they're gone, but what it's done is added depth to the other teams. And you can see now we're starting to compete, much more equally against New Zealand teams.
Mm. Have you been impressed by the standard of the Australian team so far? Certainly the rugby's been very entertaining.
I think it's been better, definitely been better. And the depth of the squads are better. Because the depth of the squads are better, that's what's improved the Australian rugby teams.
Would you expect that improvement to continue? Autumn last year, you did start to see again the Australian team start to perform better. And would you expect that again we will see an improved performance?
I've got no doubt they'll keep improving. It's where they can go to. Sawali coming in, all the criticism about Sawali. I was reading something by someone the other day saying, he's such a fantastic boy. He's such a fantastic player. We haven't seen the best of him. And that same person, like 3 months ago, was saying, we've paid too much for him. When the general sentiment was against Sawali, those leather patches, they go with that. And now the leather patches think, well, how good is he? But he's changed the team.
He is a generational talent.
You just look at the maturity and the hardness of him. You can see that's rubbing off on the team. And so a player like that, he lifts the rest of the players.
Yeah.
And if you were to get one more player like that, that can really come through with that magnitude of influence, then the whole team lifts.
I certainly think that you could see that in that England performance on that tour.
Well, you see it in New South Wales every week, mate.
Yeah.
Like he's the one that goes around. He picks up the eyes of the players. He's the one that's driving the energy. He changes the team. And, that's one of the most disappointing things, not getting the opportunity to coach him. And if we were able to get one more, which we were after at that time, another significant player like a Cameron Murray, then you're starting to change the team. And I've got no doubt Australia will keep improving. Where they can finish, can they get in the top 2 or 3 in the world? Because that's got to be the target. And which we're talking about here, Rugby Unity, for Australia to get back in 2 and 3, then rugby in Australia changes. And that's what you've got to be aiming for, which goes back to the original conversation we had.
So that's a good full stop on the Eddie podcast, which was really a podcast following you on your journey to 2023. And it was incredibly successful.
Well, at least something was successful, mate. We got one thing right. Shit.
So anyway, I'll tell you a story. I was in London earlier this year and the Lions, I sort of was looking around and getting excited by the Lions because I can't wait to see. I think it's going to be so good. I was sort of thinking to myself, I'm going to miss out on this. I don't have a job and I don't really want to go back into the machine. I don't want to go back and work for provincial rugby or national rugby. I came home and looked at the results, and certainly one of the things that struck me was the interest in the different episodes and where people were intrigued by our conversations around second-tier European rugby. There was interest in South American Super Rugby. There was interest in Everton and that story that you told about Everton and data analytics. And it got me thinking that there's something in this podcast, that there's an audience there for content that's relevant to the global game. And as I did a bit more research and listened to a lot of the very good podcasts that are out there, most of the podcasts are really focused on national areas. And where I think I've identified some white space for us to pursue through Rugby Unity is looking at the game from that global perspective and trying to have conversations that are relevant to the entire rugby community globally, and thinking about how we can, as you mentioned before, how can we engage that community of 500 million rugby fans around the world? How can we engage them in a mission to help world rugby secure the future prosperity of the game? And I think there's a real opportunity there. And I know we've spoken about it because I remember when I rang you to say, listen, I think we should do this. You said to me 3 things. You said, it'll be good for you, as in me, which is true. So thank you very much for that. 2, you said, those conversations can be had because they're probably not being had in many places. And the third thing you said was it'll be fun. And I think that sometimes
The first part of this wasn't much fun. So we might need to rewind that, mate. The other thing is rugby's at a really important stage of its development now. You know, it's still a young professional sport. But what we're seeing now is that, international rugby appears to be doing really well. Big crowds, good television money, great enthusiasm, good quality events. The game itself's pretty healthy. But then if you look underneath that, the second tier of professional rugby around the world appears to be really struggling, apart from top 14 in France and League One in Japan. And League One in Japan is still, there's a lot of money invested in that from companies who's, as a community, they're investing into it. So whether they could sustain as truly professional teams, I'm not so sure. But if you look at Super Rugby, everything else, Premiership, there's great holes in how rugby's being operated. And we know that most of the national unions around the world, apart from a few, are really struggling financially. We've got the growth of the women's game, which is fantastic. We've got the problem with HIA. We've got the problem with TMO in the game. So there's a number of key issues, I think, that need to be discussed, and we need to come up with solutions of how we can make the game better.
Which I think is the mission of what we need to do. And I think I'm calling it the third voice. So there'll be my voice, there'll be your voice, but we really want to engage the global rugby community in a conversation because World Rugby doesn't have all the answers. The national unions don't have all the answers. The professional teams don't have the answers. So perhaps if we rely on the wisdom of the crowd, we'll generate some answers and some ideas and some debate and some discussion because the bones are there and I think there are things that we can do. And certainly Brett Robinson has now been appointed chairman of World Rugby. He's been appointed on a platform of change, so he's going to have to deliver change.
What's that, different coloured leather patches, is it?
I reckon it better be more than that. It better be more than that.
That's the really interesting thing. What change are we looking for in the game?
Yeah.
Yeah, are we looking for changes to make the game better? Because you look in some sports, the catalyst to make the game healthier is a change in the game. If you look domestically in Australia, you look at NRL, when it was a wrestle, it was a referee dominated. The game wasn't that popular. Now they've made it quick and fast. The referee's less of a significant factor. The teams don't even worry about researching the referee because the game's more important. So what do they want change in? Do they want change in the game or what are they looking for? And I think that's really important. Well, because there's not enough being done about making the game better in rugby.
Well, yeah, but my understanding, though, is that at the most recent State of the Game discussion, and I'm sure you've attended many of these over the years, that the various coaches and all the various other
you don't get an invite again, mate, if you say something. The only people who get invites are the people who don't say something.
Have you been? You're on a blacklist.
I remember Steve Hansen and I were involved, and every time they wanted to talk about the game, no, we'll talk about that next week. Yeah. No, we'll talk about that next week. And there was no next week.
Yeah.
And then you don't get the invite again.
Okay, well, we can talk about it as much as we like, and we will. But interestingly, getting to that, as I say, Brett Robinson appointed chair. They're going through the development of the new strategic plan of World Rugby, and I really do think that is going to be a document that we need to study and we need to have a look at because...
Well, you'll be studying that, mate. I won't be studying it, that's for sure.
There'll
be one of those grandiose strategic plans.
Let's wait and see. And look, I suppose both of us should declare a bit of an interest here around Brett Robinson, in that we've both known him for a very, very long time. He's a close personal friend of mine and yours. We have a long history. What are your thoughts about Robbo being appointed to the big job?
Well, I think
elected to the big job.
Brett was the first captain at the Brumbies, and he was one of the most outstanding captains I work with. He was intelligent, committed, thought about the game a lot, and I'm sure he'll bring those qualities to World Rugby. But to get change in any of those big organisations is so hard. And what I think they need to do is to be really specific about where they want change. What is the biggest change that's going to make the difference to the game of rugby? What is the biggest change? And then really focus on that. Do the amount of research they need to do in proper competitions, because it's got to be about the game. Like the game dictates what everything else happens.
Yeah. And I think with Rugby Unity, what we will be doing in the program is looking and taking a deep dive into on-field issues and discussions and off-field discussions. And interestingly, around the off-field discussion, it's not all about money, but money's important. And if you looked at Robbo's platform that he ran on when he was announced the election of the results, when he came out, he said, his first priority is to secure the financial sustainability of the national union. So clearly revenue is going to be a big part of it. And would you agree that that's got to be the priority? How do we secure more money?
Well, to do that, to secure more money, you need better quality product. And that's the game.
I was watching a video the other day on YouTube of one of the owners of the New England Patriots, and they asked him the question about how do you create greater value in your franchise? And he said, simple. You get more people in more countries caring more about the game. So I think the product on the field is a part of it, but I think rugby also has other strengths off the field around values-based community, around the engagement that people have around the sport. Because I think this is one of the things around Rugby Unity, is that people have a genuine passion for the sport because they believe in many ways that it owes them something because it's created and contributed to so much of their identity. And that passion, you see it at the World Cups when you go there, that there's these global gatherings of people who love the sport. And what I'm hoping that we'll achieve through Rugby Unity is like a weekly gathering of that community where we can look at those issues. But would you agree with me? And you've travelled the world of rugby more than I have, 10 times more, and you would see it more. And I believe there is opportunity in that community if we can activate them and we can bring them together to not only continue to think about how do we improve the game, but how do we think about different ways to strengthen the game, to ensure that financial sustainability.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I don't know how that really strong community base or those values, particularly at the community level, turn into commercialism. Like, it was interesting, I was at the airport this morning, waiting for a Qantas flight. Qantas is not a sponsor, is it?
No.
Because they can have a late flight, Qantas. They're good at having a late flight. And so I'm waiting in there, and head of Australian Olympic,
Mark Arbib, just been appointed. He's the CEO of the Australian Olympic Committee.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he came over and he said, "Joe, I enjoyed the way your Japan team played against Randwick," right?
Yeah.
So that's, that was a one-off game, Japan under-23s versus Randwick on the Tuesday afternoon at Coogee. 2,000 people come.
Fabulous.
So you get that intenseness of rugby qualities, right? Mm. You have a great game, teams play against each other, they get together after the game, they have a few beers, boat race with Japan lost every boat race on tour, by the way. So, Suntory's a big sponsor of rugby in Japan, but it hasn't translated them being good at boat races. But that's what, you get people who are so enthusiastic and love those really small rugby events. I've been to 2 or 3 over the last probably 3 or 4 weeks. We had Australian Barbarians up in Coffs. Owen Finnegan was coaching the Australian Barbarians. Like, he can coach a team to a boat race as well, Owen. So they had a really good fun, but it doesn't then turn itself into commercial value, which is what we're missing at the top end of the game.
But that's the translation opportunity and challenge, because I believe there are answers to do that, because I was at that same game. We spent the morning together, and then I came down, and it was a wonderful rugby occasion. The kids were behind the grandstand tackling each other. Yeah. The rugby ball was bouncing in different directions, creating such excitement. The young girls and boys were down there having a social occasion, and I think there is something there, and we have to work out how we do that. And I think that could be the mission of part of our discovery as to look at the off-field and the on-field and how do we build that in such a way. And if we consider that, rugby's played in 135 or however many countries around the world, so we're there. And you look at the success of the North American sports at the moment and the growth of what is happening in North American sport, and their biggest strategy at the moment in terms of their future growth is international. So they're trying to get out of North America. We have this wonderful foundation across all of these incredible countries. We have this huge opportunity to grow the game because I think we can't grow it from the top. I think it's got to be bottom up and top down and from the middle as well, because these are complex systems that we're going to be doing.
You haven't left too many directions to go from.
But we've got to work at all of them. That's the point. And I do think that there's this opportunity and this white space to really put the focus on the global game and look at these opportunities. Because if you look at this runway that we've got sitting in front of us, we've got the Lions tour coming to Australia. Can't wait. This is going to be amazing. Women's World Cup later this year. That'll be transformational when you look at the change in women's sport around the world. What we're seeing in North America at the moment, what we saw in Australia here last year with the women's soccer, what we continue to see with the Australian women's soccer team. There's huge opportunity there and huge growth. The Nations Cup. I know it's not settled yet, but that set, 2 tiers, making games more competitive. World Cup in Australia 27, World Cup 29, Nations Cup again the year after that, and then off to the United States of America with Rugby World Cup 31, 33. We have to use that context. We have to use the wisdom of the crowd. We have to use the ideas that are out there, because I'm pretty sure that under Brett Robinson's leadership, he's got enough humility that if there's a good idea, he'll pick it up and he'll apply it. And I do get a sense that inside World Rugby there is a view to change, because I think they need to change, because if they don't change, there's a problem. You think what would have happened if COVID had happened before Rugby World Cup and World Rugby had not been able to secure that revenue that they got out of the Japanese World Cup in 2019?
But in reality, the only thing World Rugby can do is run good World Cups and govern the game and make the game better.
And influence.
No, they can't influence, mate.
Of course they can influence.
I don't think they can. How many national unions listen to World Rugby? They don't. So you've got this. They're a governing body that can run a great World Cup and generate finances and can make the game better. But they can't influence how. Because when you're talking about Australia here, so you got people.
No, but I'm not just talking about Australia.
But in Japan, there's different issues. Argentina got different issues.
Exactly.
Tonga, Samoa, Fiji, they've all got their unique issues.
Exactly.
So
I agree.
No one can solve those issues for them apart from themselves. But what we can do is make the game so attractive that kids want to play, sponsors want to be involved, people want to watch it on the television. And we don't have that at the moment. No. That's quite clear.
Yep. Because we don't have enough of it.
Well, people walk with their feet, mate, right?
Yep.
Yeah, there's a reason
more
why.
More people, more countries, more care. Yeah. If we stick that to that formula.
Yeah, but World Rugby can't do that, mate. I'm telling you.
Well, let's see.
And they shouldn't even be trying to do that.
Well, let's have a look at their Well, they can influence competitions. They've got the Nations Cup. I think they can influence there. Obviously, the safety issue is important. The World Cups are clearly very important.
Yeah, again, I reckon we're just missing the point, mate.
Education, I think that there's an opportunity to build capability. There is so much for us to talk about, and we will get to that.
Right.
We will get to that. And we will continue to debate. We will continue to argue. One final story, I remember years ago when we started the Brumbies, had the opportunity to be a founding member of the Brumbies, and Rod McQueen gave me his plan, which was very organised, very Rod-like, and he said, give us your views. And I gave him my views, and he said, okay, go and present to the team. And so I came up with the vision for the Brumbies was that we were going to be the world's leading provincial rugby union team. And I remember presenting that to the team, and they all fell about laughing. They all thought that this was a joke. But interestingly, at lunch, George Gregan came up and sat next to me, and he went, this world leading, I was like, mate, why not? We should be aiming for that. And slowly but surely, they picked it up. And then you arrived at the end of 1997, and it was ingrained in the place, and we started thinking about it. We started working towards, and 5 or 6 years down the track, when we had our hands on a bit of silverware, we could probably have made the claim. So we've got to think big. We've got to aim big.
Yeah.
We've got to go big. And I know there are just so many of you around the world who love the game, who want to contribute to the game. And through Rugby Unity, that'll be the opportunity to do that. And the mission, it's a big mission. What we are going to be doing is gathering together as a global community to drive the game forward so we can secure its future prosperity, because it deserves it, it needs it, and I think as a community we can do that. So it's a reasonable ambition, Eddie Jones.
No, it's a good ambition.
It's a big ambition and we should go for it, and we will ask the community for your views. And the best way to do that at the moment, we're still trying to sort out this Rugby Unity. We are building the aeroplane as we're taking off, folks.
Well, don't use Qantas. Otherwise you'll be late.
Good luck with the Japan project. How is it going at the moment?
We've got some work to do. We've got 2 tests against Wales coming up.
Yeah.
But, we're going through a rebuild there. Situations change. We've got a big job on our hands, but we can get there by the 2027 World Cup.
Another Brighton moment, perhaps, do you think?
I'll be bigger than Brighton. Actually, I was getting my hair cut yesterday, right?
Yeah.
And I said something to the barber, and an English bloke comes over and he says, I was at Brighton. It's amazing. There must have been like 700,000 people, the number of people who come up to me and said they were at Brighton.
But again, when we think of the majesty of our game, wasn't that a great occasion?
But that's what rugby's got, but it's got to get more of those.
Well,
more consistent, and it's got to be a focus on getting a better quality product.
Well, let's get to it, everybody.
We get to see, what is his chairman, Robbo?
He's the chairman.
So we've got to treat him with a lot of respect.
Well, actually, and I'm sure we will get him on the program once he's set this structure plan.
Beautiful strategic plan. I can't wait to see it.
Well, I was actually having a conversation with him prior to them going over to Hong Kong for some of their discussions, and we were talking about it. So my hopes are high. I think specific changes. So Eddie Jones, thank you very much for coming to Rugby Unity headquarters here in Canberra, Australia. You can reach out to us on all of the social. Rugby Unity is on all of the socials. And in the show notes, you'll see that there is an email address that you can email us directly. So if you'd like to do that, we'd certainly love to hear from you. I'm David Pembroke, and it's bye for now.